Welcome back then for the afternoon part of the program, where we're going to, first of all, deal with the question of what are the research implications for bioinformatics. And to help us get a handle on that, some examples on that, have assembled a panel of researchers who will talk about some of their projects and experiences and kind of both individually and then maybe talk amongst themselves about some of the issues and that they've dealt with, advantages and things they've learned with using informatics, how that's changed their research, and then also we hope to answer questions that you all have. So please be thinking of questions and make use of the panel here, which consists at in there, Courtney Hebert. Dr. Hebert is an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and also practices clinical medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases. And her research focuses on the secondary use of electronic health record data for research and quality improvement. Tim Huerta is an associate professor in both family medicine and biomedical informatics. His most recent publications focus on the analysis of the relationships between healthcare efficiency and quality measures. Simon Lin is the Chief Research Information Officer at the Research Institute at Nationwide Children's Hospital. And he has research interests in genomic medicine and using the electronic health records and health information technology to improve safety, quality, outcomes, and effectiveness. And with any luck, I'll be joined in a few minutes as well by James Chen. But in the meantime, we'll get started. And you want to start first, Courtney?
Sure. So again, I'm Courtney Hebert. I'm an assistant professor in Department of Biomedical Informatics. I'm also a physician over in the hospital, and so most of my research is actually very clinical. I look at sort of the secondary use of electronic health record data to do things like predictive modeling, help with decision support, and things like that. So I guess the question is, how have I used some of these resources in my own research and sort of my experiences? So one of the things that I need to do in order to do my research is actually get clinical data, and so I work very closely with the information warehouse and our research informatics data analysts, and so I've used Core on a regular basis, which is actually a really helpful thing. I think Core is not necessarily really that well known around the university, but it's actually a really nice way to keep track of what's going on, and you can get your IRB documents up there and interact with the information warehouse. And then I've also, I'm trying to think of other things. Oh, so as part of that, I2B2, I know we talked about this already, but as a way to kind of figure out prior to going to the information warehouse and asking for data, trying to figure out exactly what is actually out there and being just a little bit more informed about the data that's there is actually very helpful. I would say, if anyone's interested in getting data, I know we haven't really talked about this much today, but from the warehouse, really sitting down with a data analyst is the most important thing to do, because there's sometimes things that are lost in translation, and if you're actually able to sit down next to them and do a consultation with them where they can show you the kind of data that they have, that is often the most efficient way to get anything done. Other things that I've taken advantage of is Redcap. So I've used that for a couple of my studies in surveying people. It's been actually really a useful tool and a good way to interact with study subjects, and then also to have sort of a way to maintain your, to have your data and be able to download it. I'm trying to think. I've also worked with Omkar's group quite a bit. So one of the things that I'm developing within one of my larger grants is we're using clinical data and microbiology data to create predictive models to try to predict who is going to be at highest risk of a resistant infection when they come into the hospital for things like urinary tract infection or abdominal biliary infection. And so the first thing I had to do is actually get all that data, do the predictive modeling. But the end product of that is actually to create something that a clinician could actually use at the point of care. So I've worked with John Thompson that keeps on getting called out over and over, within Namkar's group to create a very user-friendly sort of interface that physicians could use. And it's actually pretty nice, and I don't know if anyone is interested in this. What John and his group can do is create something that's essentially a mock-up, but a working mock-up. And so you can use it, you can have people try it out, you can get people's feedback on what it looks like prior to it actually being connected to anything of value. And so that's what we've sort of done. So we have this nice mock-up, which was actually done much earlier in the grant than we planned on it, just because we had those resources available. And now we can sort of show that, and we can come up with ways that we're going to use it. The other big research I'm doing, I think Tim is going to talk about, so I'm going to pass along to him, and then he can just give me some shouts out while he's talking.
So my name is Tim Huerta. Trying to figure out how to start this conversation is difficult because when people say, "What do you do for a living?" my answer is like kind of everything. It's really hard for me to identify the one project I work on. I currently have 14 funded projects that look nothing like each other. So it is the nature of being someone who has expertise in the way that we use data, the way we capture data, the way we manage information, that expertise is needed in a lot of different contexts, and a lot of people don't have that expertise. And so what they end up doing is reaching out to people who do have that expertise, because when you have it at the table, you can change the way you look at the problems. You can answer the problems more efficiently, more effectively. So given that this is put on by the CTSA, I'm going to use a translational model for talking about this. My work primarily exists in T3. So if you know where T3 is, T3 sits between what we do and how we do it in terms of clinical care. So my goal is actually to figure out, to take what we know already works. We know some clinical intervention that works, and say, how do we get that in practice? How we know that hand washing works, right? How do we get people to wash their hands? And how do we use information? How do we gather information? How do we take information to drive changes in behavior? So this model about how information can be used through the standard psychological reinforcement model of, if I give you information constantly, it can change your behavior. It's kind of fundamental psychology. Was the underpinning of a center grant that we earned with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, called the Institute for the Development of Environments Aligned for Patient Safety. So that center grant, which is under the leadership of Susan Moffett-Bruce, Ann McIlerney, and myself, is basically looking at how we get information and then how we present that information back to people in a manner that allows them to modify the way that they would do things. And what I mean by modify the way that they would do things, I mean reduce the transaction cost associated with doing constant repetitive tasks, right? So if I have to do chart reviews, is there a faster way to do chart reviews? It's a simplification, but it really kind of speaks to that issue. Courtney's project within the P30 is looking at infectious data, and there are infectious preventionists who basically manually do this work on a regular basis to find out what's going on in the hospital and how we reduce infection transmission around things like MRSA and C. diff and Cowdies and Clabsies. And right now, when you get that information like a month later, right? You don't actually get that information in real time, even though the information sits somewhere in real time. And so the question is, how do you move that? Well, it's not a clinician that's going to move that, right? They don't have that expertise. What they have is domain expertise, right? What you need is someone with data expertise, with data architecture expertise, that understands the way that data is kept, the limits on data, the confounding properties of data. If you've ever tried to pull data from Epic, you will understand what I mean. It can take months to get it right, and sometimes you never know whether it was right. And the reason for that is that the way that these tables exist, it's not clearly specified how things should work. And when you think it's clearly specified, it actually doesn't work that way because someone didn't turn something on or someone turned something off. And so it's really this detective process of feeling around the data to try and find, it's like putting your hand into something and trying to find the gold piece in in a bunch of schmutz. So, it's my technical term, schmutz. And so one of the other projects that I work on is, I don't know how many of you actually go into the hospital on a regular basis. So there is something called MyChart Bedside. So MyChart Bedside is like MyChart for inpatients. When you go there, the nurses give you a tablet, and it tells you things like what your vitals are, what your lab results are, who your care team is. It lets you send messages to people. It lets you order your food. It lets you ask for someone to come and talk to you. There's all kinds of tools that are available there. And OSU was the very first academic medical center in the United States to actually implement this system, and the first one to do it facility-wide. And so we were able to parlay that with ARC into another grant to basically look at what are the outcomes associated with investing in this technology. And so part of that was we've created an infrastructure to deliver training, in-person training using clinical research assistants that go to the bedside and tell you how to use the tool, and then we let the tools help function do what it does for everyone else. And what we find preliminarily is that people who get the in-person training use these tools a lot more. And we're talking like effect sizes of, 3 times as much. And so it suggests that there are factors that influence whether people use these tools. And we're interested in things like, well, if you use bedside, and you're a heavy user of bedside, but you weren't a user in the ambulatory system, do you leave and now go, yeah, I want to use the ambulatory system to manage my chronic disease? Because the management of your chronic disease is probably the biggest driver for it's one of the biggest drivers for whether or not you're going to be readmitted within 30 days. So things like, are you getting your meds? Did you pick up your meds? What questions do you have and why aren't you taking them? All of those things are generally not answered for that patient when they're in the hospital. It's answered for that patient when they're at home. And so being able to ask those questions to your doctor becomes critical to you maintaining adherence on your medication. And so again, we know the medication works, right? We know that if you are admitted for congestive heart failure and you're given Lasix, and if you go home and you take the Lasix, you probably won't be readmitted. And a lot of people who are readmitted because they didn't fill their prescription, or they couldn't get to CVS, or they were concerned about the rules around which to take their pills. So it says take it 3 times a day. Well, is that every 8 hours? Is that every 8 hours while I'm awake? Do I have to wake up in the middle of the night to take my pills? Those little directions on the bottles can confuse people who aren't used to taking pills on a regular basis, and rather than take them erroneously, they just choose not to take them, and then they come and visit us again. So the third project we're working on in the P30 is around clinical alarms, and that's led by Emily Patterson over at the Allied Health School. And what she's looking at is, these machines that we have. If you ever walk through the hospital, you hear lots of noise, right? There's beeping and buzzing constantly. Well, that beeping and buzzing just becomes noise. And so the question is, can we change that noise to information? Can we make that noise something that when you hear it says, oh, I don't actually have to look at the machine. I know when I hear that noise that that's not a critical issue. Or I know that means that I have to go change the battery. Or I know, because right now all the beeps kind of sound the same. They're just beeps. It's like listening to Morse code. And in fact, that's it. It's just long beeps and short beeps. And you don't even know what the Morse code conversion is, right? So why not have tones that tell us things? Why not infuse sound with information? What we do there is we reduce transaction costs. We reduce the transaction costs for the people having to do this, and in fact, we've done that already, and Emily's team has brought down the number of clinical alarms, ones that actually go off, just by changing the oxygen sensor tolerances from the manufacturer specification to what we know works, the standard that OSU has chosen for SpO2's measurement, And that has gotten rid of like 2 million alarms over the course of a year. And that is one change. So imagine taking 2 million like beeps out of your life, and that's a lot. And it's these little changes about how technology how we interact with technology and technology interacts with us that requires that expertise, that informatics expertise to transform and to help provide better care, so that instead of fussing about the stuff that we don't need, the low value stuff, the stuff that isn't adding value to the quality of care, people can spend their energy adding value in the right ways. And that means, like being at the bedside and being present in the moment that the patient needs to talk to them, because they're not worried about all the beeping and all the buzzing and all the chiming. So that's my introduction.
So my name is Simon Lin. I'm a physician dropout. So I must warn you how dangerous informatics it might be. I got so much interest in data and analytics, and currently I'm running IT department, and at the same time I'm doing informatics research. So there are two things I would like to include in my introduction. One is data. Tim talked a lot about data itself, and Courtney also talked about data. What's changing in the recent years are the easiness of data collection. We used to start with individual projects, say, I'm running a diabetes project, then I will recruit my own cohort. It takes time, but I will get things rolling, get things started. So for many very successful researchers, some of them it's largely based on the cohort they started in their postdoc years or in their early career. And for the lifetime, they can keep studying this and get a lot of grants to support those activities. But things start changing. The electronic medical records, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the adoption rate in the American, it's 10%-ish, might be even lower. And nowadays, 80%, 90% of the hospital has electronic medical records. Now, data from those electronic medical records are not perfect. If you ask any specialist, you say, oh, this data is really messy. It's collected not for the purpose of my study, but it's free. It's kind of free. It's there. And you can study the complexity of the real patients. And also you can study very complicated things, because for the investigator-initiated study, typically you have inclusion-exclusion criteria. So either intentionally or unintentionally you exclude certain people. But for electronic medical record, it's a population-wide sampling. It's a whole capture of everybody. So you are able to see a variety of patients being captured in electronic medical record. That's where the tool of I2B2, the relationship of with the electronic data warehouse team to query the electronic medical record, it becomes important for many kind of research projects. So that's on the data side. There are also other examples of data collection beyond the electronic medical records. Think about a phone. How much data the phone is just collecting all of us on the background. And think about companies like Google, like Facebook. They actually know more about. I look at my Google, recently Google allowed each individual user to see what Google collect, what kind of data Google have already collected of you. So if you have a Google account, you can log in there. I recently did that. I was completely surprised how much Google know me. Google know me better than myself. I did some analytics for myself. I can see over the past 3 years, every 15 minutes where I have been, where I spend my time. Am I at office? Am I at home? Am I at shopping center? Did I go to a fast food place? Google know all that. Those are actually some of the behavioral data many researchers and epidemiologists are dreaming of. So if you start doing a survey-based research, probably you are not able to get a good capture of whatever is going on. Even you ask people to keep a diary, you don't know the integrity of the data itself. So that's how things is changing for data collection. The other point I would like to make, in addition to data itself, is it's artificial intelligence. So I call data the hinge, and artificial intelligence is the lever. So if you have a hinge and if you have a lever, you study the proper problem, you are going to make it a great outcome. Now, on the artificial intelligence side, things are also changing in the recent years. Think about a car driving themselves. Uber is doing those kind of self-driving car. Per second, the car is collecting about a terabyte. Not per second, per minute. The car is collecting about a terabyte of data. And the car is doing real-time decisions, not minute by minute, but second by second, even in a split second. The car need to make some decisions on what to do. So that's heavily rely on artificial intelligence. Now, for the world of artificial intelligence, especially people in the research domain, informatics researcher like myself, when I heard the word, I always get very mixed feeling, because in the 80s, people talked about artificial intelligence. There was a hype cycle, and it doesn't work very well in the 80s. Now, how is it different nowadays from the 80s? The major difference, I would say, it's the volume of data. So if we look at the way how artificial intelligence was done, in the 80s, it's largely rule-based system. If you remember Prolog or some of the programming language, it's based on first-order logic. The key idea is if you can model the world with rules, ontologies, you have a solution and you can automate many things. But that's very labor-intensive. Nowadays, artificial intelligence is largely driven by extremely large volume of data, and you have machine learning algorithm try to observe how humans make decisions from the extremely large volume of data and how you can train the machine to do the same job. So that's changing our daily life, artificial intelligence. Its relevance in the medical domain need to be carefully looked into, because many things in the medical domain, for certain issues, it can be relevant, but for many tasks in the medical domain, simply we do not have enough volume of the data to enable us to even to think or to do deep learning, those kind of artificial intelligence techniques. So what I would like to summarize here is with data and with newer generation of artificial intelligence, things are changing, and many medical related problems, we can look into them from a different angle. In the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be something we have never thought it's going to work in the past.
Are there any questions for the panel? Oh, yes.
I have a question for the panel. So it's interesting because you talk about data quality, right? And Courtney, you and I have had this discussion about bias, right? So in the data suffers from bias. And one of the arguments that I make is that bias only matters if it's random, if it's missing by, for example, we look at missingness. And if missingness happens randomly, then you can still make assumptions about the phenomenon that the data is missing from. In what ways do you feel that the electronic medical record is currently not missing at random? In what ways do you feel like where is the bias, and what should people be aware of in terms of bias when they're looking at their research questions, pulling data from? I mean, these are important questions because it's not just data's out there and it's perfect. We know that there's problems, and in some cases, the problems don't matter. And a lot of people think, oh, well, because we have enough information, because we have so much information, we can wash out all of this. But if data is collected in a biased way consistently, no amount of additional information will result in removing the bias. So can you talk to me about your experience with bias?
I mean, I think the major way is that usually when we talk about electronic health record data, we're talking about obviously data from an electronic health record from usually a large institution. And that includes people that came for medical care, right? So we recently did a project using statewide data. And it's claims data, which is a little different, right? Because then you get sort of everyone from multiple different areas in the state going to multiple different institutions for multiple different kinds of things. And I think then when you have missing data, it's a little bit more random. When you just look at Ohio State data, a lot of times what you have is a sicker patient population. We have a tertiary care center, and you only get people who are sick. So a lot of my research focuses, because of that, focuses on specific syndromes, like you came to the hospital with this. But if you want to ask a broader question, like someone was talking about like, does going to McDonald's 4 times a week affect cardiac health? You can't do that, right? Because even if you if you somehow took all the patients that are at OSU and then did that with them and maybe used some mobile technology, you still started off with all the patients at OSU. So they were already seeing a doctor, they were already in here. And I think that's one of the things that worries me when people keep on saying, well, we'll just get more clinical data and more clinical data and more clinical data, because it's still clinical data. And so you're still like biased by just the fact that these people are coming to the physician. And I think that's the one thing. So I always try to focus my studies on something that I feel like is answerable with the data that we have, keeping account those biases.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything Courtney said. Nowadays, there is a very hot job title called data scientist. I would say a major job of a data scientist is to not only know how to deal with the data analysis and the volume of the data, but are able to, at the very beginning, spot the bias within the data. And that's the scientific thinking all the researcher really needs. And the availability of the data, the size of the data, it's all kind of irrelevant. You have to make sure the data can answer your scientific question.
So about the holy grail of clinical informatics or health informatics would be to study someone's genetic makeup and see what their practices are, and then be able to do predictive modeling of what kind of diseases they will develop when, and then to do the interventions before that so you can prevent stuff like that. So my question is, data itself regarding these individuals. So for example, Facebook studies what you look at, what you buy, or who you interact with in order to sell you things or send you to certain websites. So there's an inherent bias in created by your practices. Do you believe that if I was to create data modeling from clinical or genetic parameters and stuff, I would then approach those patients with a certain bias to begin with and not see them in a more global context of other issues that I might need to address? And I'm talking about people from certain backgrounds, for example, or certain racial structures, and that I would, because I've now looked at data regarding those individuals, and I'm going to focus on certain things with them and kind of negate the rest.
I never have a problem going first. So I think it's an interesting question because there have actually been studies about what they can find out about you from your data. So I was listening to NPR and they were talking to one of the Facebook data scientists, and they said using Facebook's data, they can about 90% of the time tell your sexuality. It's not like you were looking at anything that indicated it. It was about how you connected, how those people, what those people were interested in, what you liked, what they liked, and through that they also do these things with Target was doing this with diapers and determining when you were pregnant. I'm certain that Amazon does it because those recommendations of what I need to buy. One day I went. My brother had a child, and I bought a bunch of diapers. And then for like a month and a half, right? Amazon thought that I must have had an army of children, right? So, I mean, my son is 27 years old. He does not need diapers, right? And I think that this is true, and so that they are doing this, but they are actually looking at the data with the perspective. The question is the data perspective neutral, right? If the data is perspective neutral, but you look at the data in a particular way, you impart a perspective on the data, which is what I think they are doing, right? Look at Google flu trends, right? There's an example of they took data that was perspective neutral, and they said, can we model this, right? And it modeled correctly in some cases and incorrectly in others. For me, the biggest problem, and you talked about AI. For me, the biggest problem about the black box of AI, because it is a black box system based on the neural networks we use, is that what it unfortunately is doing is typing people more and more. So if you look at Yahoo's, if you ever use Yahoo uses an algorithm that identifies what stories you would likely click on and puts those in the list of stories it gives you higher in the list. Well, so what you end up is with this, the bubble or the echo chamber. And in medical, so what are you going to do when we build a system that does this and someone comes over and looks like they have, looks like they're suffering from a cold, and the machine tells you that they're suffering from a cold, but in fact they're having a stroke, right? Because the pattern of symptoms, et cetera, just kind of matches for that patient. Because there's not one way that people manifest these things. And it's the reason why our current generation of AI, for me, is problematic. What we're doing is figuring out what can we learn about this person as if that nugget of information is truth. Like, we know more about that person, and therefore this is that person. Well, what we know is that using all of the data, this likely represents what this person is. But I'm going to say one of the things I commonly say because my wife is wonderful. She's a theoretic psychologist, and she points out in statistics, basic statistics, you cannot take principles, you cannot take measures of populations and impart them to individuals. You are not 52% female. Right? So Why do we not accept that? But in terms of precision medicine right now, we're trying to say, you have a 46% chance of getting cancer. This is a problem that we have to break. We have to figure out the math, the statistics, the way to deal with these problems. They may guide us, right? They may give us numbers that will guide us, but they are meant to be guidance right now. They are not meant to be truth. And I think that's the big challenge around moving from the information we find and making assumptions about it to suggesting that this is truth.
I think also just when we talk about, just to piggyback off that, when we talk about clinical decision support, sometimes we have these great mathematical models and they really work well. But then there's actually, and this comes into informatics, is how do you actually portray that to a physician or any other type of clinician in a way that they can understand it, so they're not misinterpreting what they're seeing. They don't see this patient has a 20% risk, and they just assume that, or this patient has an 89% risk of something, and they just assume that that patient has it. But you have to sort of explain it in a way that is truthful, but also like gets across the message. You sort of understand the variability here, and that we're not telling you some truth about the patient. We're telling you kind of this estimation based on population parameters. And I think that's actually really difficult because you can't write all that in. It needs to be something that's usable and helpful and pretty and easy to use while still not lying. Pretty, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of the data, when it's combining genetics, social behavior, demographic, if you put all this together, I would like to point out another thing. Privacy becomes a very interesting topic. It really needs further research in this domain. The traditional way of thinking, we are removing the HIPAA identifiers, but still there is a huge risk you can re-identify the person. So there are many other dimensions of data privacy, and really it's how we protect people's privacy and what's the best use of the data.
So I'm a nurse by background, and my role is to kind of opposite of what you guys do, is help clinicians get information in. And they don't always do it in a way, you talk about bias. Bias is one way, but also in a way we hear a lot about, as clinicians, we're not able to get a story from out of our record very easily. And Courtney knows this from practicing. So, I mean, just a physician, someone who works with physicians and a physician dropout, what does that look like, going forward? And how do we utilize things, where do you see things like natural NLP and AI? One of the things that I really struggle with, and Tim kind of alluded to this, is the fact that people have an inherent trust in technology that's not always well grounded. I didn't go to school, none of us went to school to have a computer tell us how to treat a patient. Yet I see it time and time again. There's this kind of lack of willingness to be able to pick up a phone and have a real conversation, or to be able, for our electronic medical record vendors to be able to present information to clinicians in a way that's not necessarily all discrete data, but in a way that paints a picture of what's going on with the patient. That's a huge problem. And the greatest example I have is sort of that man-machine interaction is, nurses learn early on, go and look at the patient before you start to code the red line on the monitor, or the flat line on the monitor. But we've taken that scenario where the patient just lost their lead and monitors going nuts to a whole nother dimension with all of these other things around clinical decision support, and in my mind, to some degree, over-reliance on AI and decision support.
I'll go first again. So Interestingly enough, if you actually look at where data has been present for a long time, all right, so let's be clear here. The reason why there are electronic medical records everywhere right now was the HITECH Act. That basically gave people a bunch of money to install electronic medical records, right? If you go back into organizations like governments who have had electronic systems for a long time, they've actually identified a 5-step model for development of these things, and we're in the very first step of that model. All right, so the first thing is you build systems to collect data that you did on paper, right? So effectively, you've taken a paper-based system and you've made it electronic. And the second one is then you say, well, so what can we do with this? What can we do to make things happen faster? Right? It's not until you get to the 4th or 5th generation where you're saying, what can we do that we couldn't do before? That happens. And I think what we're seeing because of all of the investment in this is we're going to see that process that took 20 years in digital governance to take something like 10 years in healthcare. But it's right now, we're still practicing how to put all the data in the system. I went over to one of our clinics, and I was talking to someone about how we could automate Coumadin adjustments for patients. So they really have, it's really, someone comes in, they're on Coumadin, a blood thinner, and you get tested on a regular basis to see whether or not you have too much or too little of the medication, and there are algorithms and all that. And I began talking to them, and they pointed out that there are 7 places where that data exists, the exact same data in the electronic medical record. And the difference of where it goes is practice difference, right? Some people put it here, some people put it here, some people put it there. And so you can't it's really difficult to create a single system that pulls all of this together and says it could check all of these different places, because sometimes you don't even know that there's another place to put it. And we're really in that people have built these giant architectures, and as a result, they've maximized flexibility so that you have the flexibility to build or do anything. Well, the more flexibility you have, the harder it is to standardize. And so I think what we're going to see is a contraction. We're going to see those 7 ways of putting in that information are going to become 1 or 2 ways to put in that information. And to get to that point, to get to those places, it's going to be faster. We will optimize how we do that. But right now, the structure is not optimized, the process is not optimized. All we're doing is collecting data. And I can understand from a clinical perspective how that is infuriating, because it's all my effort in, nothing back. But that's not, you can't, we don't even know what needs to come back yet. We're still trying to learn what needs to come back. And so I think that that's the opportunity for researchers and clinicians to work together to figure out what needs to go back. How can informatics help you identify what needs to go back in meaningful ways? And I think that there are some opportunities there.
I would just say about NLP, I think barring the complete gutting of the way we do electronic health records and some completely new thing, I think NLP is sort of a necessary component of making sense of medical records at this point, especially in that sort of story way, because they've tried again and again to have things discretely stored and still be able to so I don't usually only use discrete data, but that's because, again, I'm asking a question that you could use just discrete data generally for. But if you want to ask those bigger questions, if you want to really know what happened with these patients, then most of the researchers are using NLP to do that. But whether or not we can put that into practice in a reasonable way and actually have it be useful, I think is a big question. And I think right now, I think our records just aren't set up to do that. And so I'm very pragmatic, so I sort of think answer the questions you can't answer now, figure out the questions you can answer, and what you need to do to get there, and either collect that data or, come up with some genius idea about how to get to the next step. But I think NLP is certainly the way to go. It'd be great to see us at OSU do something bigger with NLP, create sort of a pipeline to help researchers, but.
Yeah, as a physician dropout, I'm very much annoyed by how my doctor is taking care of me nowadays. I'm coming to see the doctor, I pay him because I really want to tell him my story. He's not listening. Usually the doctor is busy with the computer, put down some drop-down menu, filling in some click here, click there. And many of those clicks, it's irrelevant to my story. I'm paying him, really, it's asking him his experience, based their his clinical judgment, and tell me his rationale. Many of those are not captured. The rationale is not captured in the electronic medical record. It's more of a bunch of diagnosis codes, a bunch of medication prescribed, mechanically put together for billing purpose. That's what we have nowadays for Epic. And as Courtney said, it's the technology is gyrational. At the very beginning, if you look at some of the very old electronic medical record, even before relational database was the greatest thing, it's largely based on text. The Regan Street medical record system, a bunch of Vanderbilt has done, those older generation medical record system, it's text. And then it's moved into structured data collection. Nowadays, I think with NLP capabilities, things might reverse. Even in our daily life, voice recognition, image capturing, Google Glasses, all those kind of things becomes much more doable. So the newer generation of medical record would not necessarily based on structured data collection.
So I have two comments. The first is just some comments that I made about collecting, about using data from a physician standpoint. I'm just a resident, and I think most of us, as in our training, when we went through medical school, when you talk to a patient, we give you this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, and in your brain you put those symptoms and create a differential diagnosis, and you start with whatever is at the top of the differential diagnosis. And to be honest, I don't see how that is different from what the computer is doing, essentially giving you the same differential diagnosis, and you take that information. Unfortunately, our brains are just too smart and just too big, and sometimes the computer, whether we like it or not, can get smarter than what we can store more information than our brain can store at a particular time, so that you don't have your primary care doctor or something completely missing out on the diagnosis, or they didn't think about it, that if the computer had jogged their memory, they would have thought, oh, maybe I should think about this thing. So I think there's like a school of thought of people that really want technology to come out of healthcare and go back to the doctor doing all the thinking, but I think that is kind of mistaken. I think it's an opportunity for doctors to, yes, still listen to their patients and still get information, but also realize that there's only so much that a human brain can handle that this computers are supposed to, or this data that the computer already has in the system is supposed to provide you with. And when I talk to my attendants, they tell you about how much information they learn in medical school versus what I learned versus what is currently being taught, and the information just keeps growing. And at a certain point, only one person can only keep so much information in their brain. And so I think that's where the data that's already been collected is in the system. The computer can help you think about some of those things. The second thing I wanted to ask your opinion or your thoughts on is, when I talk to my other residents and other people that do research, one of the things that we worry about is the actual data collection process. So, for example, if somebody publishes a study using either the, I'm just going to use an example and say like the AACR database, or one of the other major databases. One of the things that we get concerned about is, one, who's collecting this data, and secondly, how do you then apply that to your patients? Because for example, like historical database, for example, you know that some of us input some of that data and based on, somebody extracts that data based on what we put in the system, but it doesn't always match. So if I'm doing a procedure, I try to approximate the procedure as best as I can, but it doesn't have to approximate it within what there's an IC code for. It doesn't always match what the patient actually had. And how do you balance that process of making sure that the data that you're using, they might have run really great statistics that give you really great percentages and and standard errors and risk and so on, that going back to the actual data collection process, how do we, who uses data, figure that out and try to get that into a decision?
I mean, I think that's the problem with anyone who does any sort of data science is just data quality, right? And so knowing where you got this data and how people are collecting data. I know I work with a computer scientist here who's really interested in sort of that first step in terms of data quality. So, improving the process of actually entering data for somebody who's entering data, whether it's a clinician or a researcher or someone who's, just doing data collection, so that they try to reduce error or bias as much as possible. And I think we're not there with a lot of things. I think that one of the things that I try to do when I do any study is to really think about those things, think about the limitations that were involved in the study and try to at least speak to them. Because I think the more we kind of talk about those things, the better. And then I just wanted to comment on what you said initially, because I think that's something we didn't talk about. So there's been this huge growth in clinical data. There's also been this enormous growth in knowledge, right? Knowledge databases. And I think being a doctor has very much changed. So even, and I'm not that advanced in my career, but from the time that I started as a resident to now, when I started as a resident, we had, pieces of paper in our pocket. I had a little booklet with all these things that you need to do with people's sodium, with this and with that. I had 1 or 2 calculators that I knew where to go to on a website. Now, everything that we do, we look up. We double check. We see where the guidelines are, and there's just so much more of that. And even within our electronic health record, we're able to go to these reference things, and there's more and more of that going on. So I think we're having this evolution of more and more data, but also a complete change in what we are as clinicians. So you're still making all of the decisions, but you're making them honestly based on a lot better data, which I think is really important. So I agree with you that I think that having computers help with that sort of process of just combing databases and getting you information is really important. It doesn't take away from the art of, trying to figure out what's going on. I think that's actually a positive direction, but we have to figure out how to put that into a workflow, because it actually slows us down a bit too when we have all this information to come through.
Yeah, think about genomics. If you want to do precision medicine kind of practice, where, say, even on a lower end of the estimate, 30,000 of genes of the genome, are you able to have a good understanding of those genes, what they do, and if you see a mutation, what does that mean? So those kind of knowledge base, it's going to dramatically help clinical practice.
Well, to thank our panel and thank you all for your questions.